When Emperor Otto II was in Rome in 981 to consolidate his influence in Italy, he met with an unexpected problem. The Saracen Emir of Sicily had been threatening southern Italy for some time, and now Pandulf Ironhead, who had previously kept the Saracens at bay, had died. Otto decided to intervene and summoned an army from his homeland. A short time later, around 2,100 heavy cavalrymen, called Panzerreiter in German, which literally translates as tank rider, marched across the Alps to aid their emperor. According to a medieval document known as Indiculus Loricatorum, literally the small list of armored cavalry, almost 2/3 of these troops came from bishops and abbeys. But why did clergymen, who were legally not allowed to bear arms or wage war, send so many troops? What role did these people play in the warfare of the time? And what did their involvement look like in practice? In this video, we will answer these questions using the example of Reichenau Abbey. To commemorate the founding of this abbey 1,300 years ago, the Baden State Museum invited us to Constance in May, where Marvin Gedigk, a research assistant at the museum and podcaster at Epochentrotter, took a few other history content creators and Roman on a tour of Reichenau and the anniversary expedition World Heritage of the Middle Ages. He kindly agreed to participate in this video and provide input on the history of the Monastic Island. Many thanks, Marvin. In 981, Reichenau Abbey provided one of the largest contingents of all the abbeys in the empire, 60 heavy cavalrymen. Because of this, it is particularly well suited as a case study to show how monasteries and bishops waged war under the Ottonian Dynasty in the 10th century. When the reinforcements arrived in Italy, Emperor Otto II made his way south, meeting the Saracens at the Battle of Stilo on July 13, 982. Otto's heavy cavalry attacked head-on, forcing their opponents to retreat and killing the emir. But just when they thought the battle was won, a detachment of Muslim cavalry charged out of the rugged terrain and attacked their flank, almost completely wiping out the emperor's surprised cavalry. It was not unusual for clergymen to take part in military campaigns. In fact, imperial churches were a central military support for all kings and emperors after the time of Charlemagne. For a large part of the Middle Ages, it was common for ecclesiastical princes to participate in wars. To understand this, we must look at their role in the empire's power structure. However, before we begin, please note that we have simplified things considerably in this video due to the complexity of the information required to explain a monastery's involvement in warfare. If you want to dive deeper, we recommend these 3 books as a starting point. You can find them in the description. Also, please note that up until now, we've financed our videos mainly with sponsorings, but currently we're trying to avoid that if possible from a financial point of view, thus the lack of sponsor in the last videos. If you do find our content valuable, please consider liking the video, commenting down below, or donating via Patreon, PayPal, or YouTube. This makes sure we can continue to produce videos such as this one, which took a lot of research to produce. We're grateful for every like, every comment, and every donation. Today, monasteries are places of peace, religion, and seclusion. At first glance, this doesn't seem to fit with the fact that they had their own troops in the Middle Ages. But if we take a closer look at what a monastery actually was, it quickly becomes apparent that our modern idea is wrong. Marvin explains why.
Monasteries were much more than the homes and retreats of humble monks. They were also places of knowledge, education, and business, and therefore, to a certain extent, places of power. In its heyday between the 9th and 11th centuries, Reichenau Monastery was one of the most important players in the empire in economic, political, and cultural matters. The monastery had one of the largest libraries in Christian Europe and owned vast estates, and was therefore quite wealthy.
Just how rich the Reichenau Abbey was is illustrated by the fact that Otto II expected the abbot to provide 60 armored horsemen, whereas he demanded no more than 40 from the secular princes, the counts. These horsemen were of a very particular kind, known in German as Panzerreiter, meaning armored riders. As the elite cavalry of the time, they were very expensive. These panzer cavalrymen were heavily armored, wore chain or scale armor, and probably needed at least 3 horses and a servant each. The surplus of a full 12 farms was required to equip one such soldier. This means that the Reichenau Abbey needed 720 farms to supply the horsemen sent to Italy alone. The crucial question then becomes, how did monks who were supposed to renounce worldly things come to have such influence and wealth? The answer lies in the relationship between the church and the kingship or empire. In the Middle Ages, religion and power were inextricably linked. Ruling meant representing God's will on earth and ensuring law and order in his name. For example, this close connection is represented by Charlemagne's self-description as king by the grace of God. The churches legitimized the power of kings and emperors and thus became the most important pillar of their power. A kind of symbiosis developed, culminating in the 10th century, in what older scholars often refer to as the Imperial church system, a term that is highly controversial today. The debate about the Imperial church is still ongoing, but it is generally agreed that the Ottonian rulers had significant influence on the churches. According to the historian Rudolf Schiefer, in most cases, they decided who was appointed bishop or abbot of an imperial abbey. This led to the increasing resistance of the church and eventually to the famous investiture controversy at the end of the 11th century. The Ottonians gave key ecclesiastical positions to men who were loyal to them, thus creating a counterweight to the secular princes, who often placed their own interests above those of the empire. To this end, they granted land, sovereign rights, and so-called immunities to the bishoprics and abbeys. Through immunities, the ecclesiastical possessions became independent of the local secular nobility and their jurisdiction, and were instead directly subject to the king or emperor. The rulers thus killed 2 birds with 1 stone. The secular princes, who were always causing them problems, lost influence, while the ecclesiastical princes became more powerful. This arrangement was in the emperor's interest, because the clergy was under imperial influence and, at least officially, was not allowed to produce descendants. As a result, clergymen could not pass on their office, which was increasingly common among the secular nobility. In exchange for donations from the rulers, the endowed abbeys had to perform the so-called servitium regis, or royal service. This included diplomatic and political advice, regular contributions, and religious support through prayer. The most important duties were providing accommodation and food for the king and performing military service. So imperial abbeys and bishops not only took part in certain campaigns, but were also an integral part of the Ottonian army. Reichenau Abbey provides a good example of what this looked like. The monastery was particularly close to a whole series of rulers.
The ruling Carolingian dynasty eventually turned Reichenau Monastery into a so-called Imperial Abbey. Under Charlemagne, the abbots of Reichenau were entrusted with important organizational and personal tasks, such as the education of his son Pippin. Reichenau Abbey's proximity to the ruler continued in the following decades and centuries, right up until the 10th and 11th century. Another Carolingian, Charles III, also known as Charles the Fat, was even buried in the cathedral of Reichenau Abbey. Otto I and Otto II, among others, later visited the abbey personally. Documents like the world-famous Confraternity book bear witness to this.
This also had an impact on the abbey's property. It was provided with extensive estates in the 1st century after its foundation, and its belongings grew enormously over the next several centuries through donation and endowments, until it owned extensive lands in the south of the Holy Roman Empire. Land ownership was crucial because during this time rulership was above all manorial, meaning that the landowner ruled not only the land but also the people who lived on it. The lord provided security, law and order, and in return received taxes, tributes, and services. He then had himself to provide services and pay taxes to the king in proportion to his ownership. Abbeys were also important for the kingdom as hubs of administration and writing. In the Middle Ages, writing was power. Before book printing, texts were copied by hand, and reproducing them was a time-consuming process. Monks were among the few groups with the necessary knowledge and skills to do this. In the scriptoria, the writing rooms of the monasteries, they created and copied historical documents, charters, lives of saints, and much more. The monks of Reichenau Abbey excelled at this, creating some manuscripts that became world famous.
The manuscript production of the Reichenau monastery produced extremely important texts for Christian Europe, but, and I would say that this is what distinguishes the monastery to this day, it also produced real works of art, because the book illumination, especially in the 10th and 11th centuries, was truly outstanding and was appreciated at the time. We have, for example, commissioned productions by Archbishop Egbert of Trier, who commissioned 2 manuscripts from Reichenau, precisely because he appreciated the book illuminations. We also find many other magnificent manuscripts that were created during this period. The outstanding status of the Reichenau book illumination is still reflected today by the fact that 10 of these manuscripts have been declared UNESCO World Documentary Heritage. 5 of them are on display in our exhibition. In addition to the 2 manuscripts by Egbert mentioned above, there is the Gero Codex and the Liutar Gospels, for example, which can both be seen in the exhibition.
In a world where few people could read and write, those who could read, copy and create documents had significant influence. This was particularly important because kings and emperors at the time were constantly traveling from palatinate to palatinate, that is, from royal base to royal base, and had no administrative apparatus of their own. Instead, they relied on the church's organizational structure, brought monks into their writing rooms, or assigned the administrative work directly to a monastery. As a result, the administration of the churches and the realm grew ever closer together. This is reflected, for example, in the fact that Henry I established the court chapel, bringing a permanent staff of clergymen to his court, thus involving the abbots and bishops more closely in the administration of the realm. Monasteries were an essential resource for kings and emperors in this area, and therefore gained a considerable influence. Not everything we just explained applies to all monasteries, but many functioned not just as retreats for monks who had turned their backs on the world, but as places of power. Because imperial abbeys were obliged to serve the king in the army, they had to maintain their own troops. In fact, a large part of the Ottonian military capacity was in the hands of bishops and abbots. The bishoprics and many important monasteries were very wealthy and had a sizable army at their disposal. We will now look at how this worked, and how monasteries took part in war in practical terms. Of course, simple monks did not throw themselves into battle with drawn swords. Instead, each abbey had a circle of vassals, men who were personally loyal to the abbey. They were given a fief, usually a piece of land, and swore loyalty and military allegiance in return. The abbot could summon them if the abbey needed troops, or the king assembled an army. Nevertheless, the obligation to perform military service remained a moral dilemma for many clergymen, partly because abbots and bishops sometimes had to go to war personally if they were obliged to do so as vassals. Some of the princes in the Indiculos were also supposed to go to Italy themselves, as can be seen from the fact that the Latin verb mittere, meaning to send, is used for certain troops, and ducere, meaning to lead, for others. The abbot of Reichenau Abbey was also supposed to lead his contingent to Italy in person, but as far as we know, he did not do so. In principle, clergymen were forbidden to bear arms and wage war. Whether and under what conditions they were allowed to do so was a theological issue that occupied scholars through the Middle Ages. The Church constantly issued new prohibitions, while emperors and kings no longer wanted to do without the military clout of the clergy. In practice, the clergy increasingly took an active part in wars. This was not at least because more and more nobles aspired to careers in the church. The second and third son of a family had no prospect of inheriting his father's fortune because of primogeniture, which means that the inheritance usually went to the firstborn. However, they could make a good living as a clergyman. As a result, the worlds of the nobility and the clergy became ever more linked, with bishops and abbots increasingly coming from secular backgrounds. In the case of abbeys, not all abbots were clerics. There were also so-called lay abbots, laymen who had been enfeoffed with an abbey. They were its patrons and benefited from its income, but had nothing to do with the day-to-day life of the monks. Archbishop Brun of Cologne's example shows how contradictory and closely connected spiritual and secular offices could be. Brun was elected archbishop at the instigation of Otto the Great in 953 and appointed Duke of Lorraine in the same year. He thus combined a secular and an ecclesiastical office in one person. The contradictions were apparent. Brun was not allowed to bear arms as a bishop, but as a duke he was obliged to march into battle at the head of his army. This was completely unheard of even in the 10th century, when the involvement of high-ranking clergy in military undertakings was generally accepted without question. The clergy's most important military task was to support their lord as vassals. To this day, we know very little about the organization of the Ottonian armies. According to the German historian Hagen Keller, the Indiculus Loricatorum is the only source of their time that provides concrete figures on the composition of a royal army. The small list of armored cavalrymen gives us a unique, but unfortunately also coincidental insight into the composition of an East Frankish army in the 10th century. Assuming that this composition is comparable to others, the clergy would have contributed 2/3 of all the troops in the empire. However, this should be taken with a grain of salt. Most historians assume that the Indiculus lists a supplementary contingent and that Otto II already had a large army with him when he moved to Rome. In this case, it could well be that many secular princes were already in Italy with their troops, and were therefore not required to send additional forces. So, monasteries did not go to war as monasteries, but as vassals of the king or territorial lords. Their military service could take various forms. Based on a source from the 11th century, the Chronicon of Thietmar of Merseburg, the historian David Beckrek constructed a 3-part military organization model of the Ottonian army in the 10th century. According to Thietmar, the troops consisted of a general levy, selected or expeditionary levies, and professional troops. An imperial abbey such as the Reichenau contributed to all 3 areas. The general levy, or Burgbann in German, was exclusively a means of defense. If a region was threatened, the sovereign could conscript all able-bodied men. These were not professional fighters, but men from all walks of life, who were often poorly armed. They were particularly useful if they could defend a fortified position. Such strongholds were provided by the so-called refuge castles throughout the empire, where people took refuge in the event of an attack. This system was part of a so-called defense in depth, a defensive strategy in which the enemy was not stopped at the border, but was gradually weakened by a network of defensive positions. This allowed the local population to defend themselves against attacks, even when no army was available. The maintenance of these castles and the organization of conscripts were part of the duties of the territorial lords, and thus, if they had the corresponding immunities, those of the bishoprics and abbeys. The selected or expeditionary levies were designated conscripts who could be called up for offensive campaigns, that is, for service outside their home country. According to the historian Martin Klaus, they were also primarily foot soldiers because, for a substantial part, wars of conquest resolved around fortresses, where infantry was crucial. Men who were conscripted for service in expeditio, for expeditionary service, made up the largest part of offensive armies. The obligation to provide men for offensive campaigns was again linked to property. The richer a person or institution was, the more troops they were required to provide. Usually they had to send 1 foot soldier with a sword and a shield per mensus. A mensus initially referred to the area of a manor, and later the income corresponding to a manor. Anyone who owned 12 menses had to enlist as heavy cavalry with chainmail or scale armor, helmet, shield, spear and 2 swords, 1 long and 1 short. Those with more than 12 menses had to provide more troops according to their income. For example, a man with 15 menses had to serve as heavy cavalry and bring 3 additional foot soldiers. it was the task of the territorial lord to keep precise records of the property of the men in his domain and to organize deployment. In practice, this was quite complex because there were often overlaps, such as when the Imperial Abbey's vessel had land in the domain of a count. This is precisely where the privileges and immunities the Ottonians were increasingly granting to bishoprics and abbeys came into play. In 1003, for example, Henry II granted military immunity to Essen Abbey. This gave the abbess the sole right and duty to mobilize the people in the abbey's territory. The third component of an Ottonian army consisted of professional soldiers. The wealthiest princes had to provide hundreds of fighters. This is why many of them decided to maintain permanent troops instead of spontaneously recruiting large numbers of well-equipped men in the event of war. These professional fighters are referred to in the sources as milites, or soldiers. The Reichenau's heavy cavalry also belong to this category. A soldier, especially one who fought on horseback, needed expensive equipment and intensive training. He had to specialize in the warrior profession. This was only possible if he was provided for in other ways, and above all, if he was released from other obligations. Because this was so expensive, these men were mostly not paid in cash. Instead, they either lived directly in their master's household, ate at his table, and slept in his rooms, or received benefits that enabled them to be freed from other duties. For example, they were often given fiefs, primarily cultivated farms, whose surplus could be used to finance their equipment and upkeep. For an abbey like Reichenau, which, as we have seen, owned extensive estates, this was a practical solution for supplying and equipping the troops it had to provide. So, the 60 armored horsemen the abbey sent to Italy in 981 were vassals who served in the army on its behalf. The crux of the matter is that abbeys were not just religious institutions. They were also centers of knowledge, economy and power, and as territorial lords and vassals, they had to provide military support. Together with the bishops, they were an essential economic and military pillar of the empire. The exact extent of their involvement cannot be determined from the currently available sources. What is certain, however, is that many a secular prince could not provide 60 heavy cavalrymen.
During this video we have shown you some parts of our exhibition and the monastery island of Reichenau, but I strongly recommend that you come to Lake Constance to see the rest. It is a unique cultural historical exhibition because this is the first time these exhibits are presented together in 1000 years, and it is extremely unlikely that this will happen again, making this a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Such exhibitions very rarely take place at the site of their history, but in this case there are a mere 7 kilometers between Constance and Reichenau. So you not only have the chance to see top exhibits, but also to get to know the cultural landscape of the monastery island itself. Above all, you can immerse yourself in its 3 Romanesque churches, which are in a truly spectacular state of preservation.